So I want to first start by talking about the plight that plants are facing in the world, in the country. Our flora, about 30% of it is considered rare or of concern, and that puts us as the fourth most threatened flora in the world after Mauritius, the Seychelles, and St. Helena. So that's a little bit of an artifact of the fact that our flora is very well studied, and we know what we had, and we know what's gone extinct, and we know what's rare. But it's also an indication of the impact we've had in just a few hundred years on the flora of the U.S. Overall, in the world, about 12 to 15% of the flora is considered rare. And many estimates, including those by Peter Raven and E.O. Wilson and some other very prominent biologists, indicate that about half the species, about a third of the species in the world may become extinct in the next 50 years, and 2/3 by the end of the century. In the U.S., although plants make up the majority of the list, and this data goes back about 5 years, but the trends and the percentages are still roughly the same. So plants, although you never hear about endangered plants, make up about 60% of the endangered species list, but they get very little funding. You can see the funding here trend for animals and plants here along the bottom. It hasn't gotten any better in the last decade. In fact, it's probably gotten worse. We have a number of different agencies managing our federal lands in the U.S. About a third of the U.S. is federally managed. But they're not spending much money on taking care of that land. Park Service, about $17 an acre. Fish and Wildlife Service, a little over $7. Forest Service, nearly $7. Bureau of Land Management, which owns the largest chunk of our federal land, only about $3 an acre. Okay, I have about 1/8 of an acre, and I spend a lot more than that on trying to keep the weeds out and trying to put native plants in. The situation isn't any better when you look at staffing on our federal lands. The average federal botanist is responsible for about 4 million acres. Okay, I can't even take care of my 1/8 of an acre. So imagine if you had 4 million acres, what you'd be facing trying to keep the weeds off, trying to deal with the threats to the plants and animals. This is in part where I think botanic gardens can come in, and botanic gardens are playing a role in plant conservation in the U.S. Botanic gardens are considered one of the most concentrated areas of species richness. We have a large number of species that are documented. We know where they came from. They're growing in a single area. And we're really evolving. We used to be kind of a collection of curiosities that, you could come and you could go, oh, wow, look at these plants from Asia, from Australia, from all over the world. But now I think we see ourselves more as conservation centers, that we're focusing less on having a very diverse collection of one individual and having genetically representative samples of particularly endangered plants. We have about 150 million visitors collectively every year, and so that's a great way for the public to get exposed to plants and plant science and learn about conservation issues. So ex situ conservation, or off-site conservation, the kind of conservation we do at botanic gardens and zoos, is delivering a lot of things. We have in the world 1,800 botanic gardens that have 2.5 million collections of plants representing about 18,000 species. There are 100 species roughly in gardens that are extinct in the wild, and many collections in gardens vastly outnumber things in the wild, including this plant. This is Brighamia insignis, cabbage on a stick, endemic to the Hawaiian Islands, found only on the Nepali coast of Kauai. And it's threatened by goats. A whole bunch were wiped out by the last hurricane. May be extinct in the wild, we're not sure. Its biggest problem is its pollinator's gone extinct, and so it's only setting seed if botanists rappel down those cliffs and hand-pollinate it. But it's well represented in botanic gardens, and you can come and you can see it at our garden and others, and that provides a source of material that ultimately could be reintroduced to the wild if habitat is available. So here in Illinois, we have nearly 350 species of plants that are state listed, considered rare. We're the prairie state, but we have decimated our prairie. It's almost all been turned over to agriculture. So less than 1/100th of 1% of tallgrass prairie remains in Illinois. And ironically, most of the rare species in the state are found in Cook and Lake counties. When you think how developed our area is up in the northeast corner, we do have a nice forest preserve system, and we do have some protected areas, and those areas have never gone under the plow like most of the rest of the state. So here's our garden. We're 385 acres in Glencoe. We are owned by the Forest Preserve District of Cook County and managed by the Chicago Horticultural Society. Our mission is to promote the enjoyment, understanding, and conservation of plants in the natural world. In particular, related to conservation, we're focused on addressing anthropogenic threats to plants. Things that we're doing that are harming plant communities, things like climate change, invasive species, habitat loss and fragmentation, nitrogen pollution. We're working both by seed banking and ex situ conservation methods and by habitat restoration, reintroduction, and in situ conservation methods. So I want to go through some of the research activities we're doing. You'll see they have a very applied bent and are mainly focusing on these threats to plant biodiversity. So in restoration genetics, for example, we're asking the question, when you're doing a plant reintroduction or plant restoration, does seed source matter? How far away can you go to collect seed and have it work in a site here? We've tested this in 2 species of lobelia here locally in the Midwest. We've also tested it in 3 species of penstemon, 3 species of eriogonum out west in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management. So here's an example. Lobelia cardinalis, cardinal flower, and syphilitica, great blue lobelia, have different pollinators. And so we thought that cardinalis being pollinated by hummingbirds might be a little more what's the word? We'll go the other way. Lobelia syphilitica might be more sensitive to long-distance outcrossing because it has a smaller neighborhood size. And so we did these crosses of different distances, and what we found is what you might expect, that these are nearest neighbor crosses. In the first generation, the nearest neighbor cross did more poorly than the other crosses, a sign of inbreeding depression. But these long-distance crosses here are about the same as the others, and so there's no evidence of outbreeding depression or a reduction in fitness from a long-distance cross. But we saw the opposite in syphilitica, that when you do move seeds or pollen of this species more than 100 kilometers, you start to have plants resulting that are less fit. Here are the penstemon species we worked with out west, sites of our common gardens out there. Again, the same story, that the reproductive output from different populations are quite different depending on where you grow them. The overall message from the penstemon and the eriogonum work was that elevation and winter temperature were very critical. And you're better going a little further and having seed come from the same elevation and the same winter temperature than staying close and going up and down in elevation. This is a figure that shows the importance of winter temperature. Here's January average temperature on the bottom. This is days to germination. You can see where the winters are very cold. You need a long time before seeds germinate. Where the winters are warmer, less time to germinate. If you swapped seeds between sites where you had very different winter temperatures, they'd germinate at the wrong time and die. This is another project looking at rare Lespedeza leptostachya, Leslep we call it here. and a native congener, Lespedeza capitata. They co-occur. There seems to be more synchrony in bloom time recently than there has been in the past, and the two are showing signs of hybridization. We had a grad student actually document the hybridization between the two, and it is occurring, and it is occurring at a disturbingly high rate. And it brings up an interesting management question. Do you remove a common native species from a site where this rare species occurs in order to preserve the genetic integrity of the rare species? Or do you accept that this is a natural hybridization process between two native species that may result in the loss of the rare species and let it go ahead? I don't know the answer to that, but if anyone has thoughts, I'd be happy to hear about them. This is another rare plant, eastern prairie fringed orchid. This is one that's been managed a lot by hand pollination to increase seed set, to provide seed to do restoration in other parts of the state. And we asked the question, is there a cost to making that plant make so many offspring? We know that offspring are costly. If you have them, you know that. And it's the same thing for plants. They need to invest some nutrients in those seeds. And if typically a plant makes 3 or 4 seed capsules, and by hand pollinating it, we're making it make 10 or 15, are we killing mom by doing that? And the answer is, at really high levels, yes, we are. But there's an optimal level, and that's 30% pollination, where the maternal plant stays healthy and survives. And I think yes, I do have a figure of that. Here at 30%, these are flower number, leaf width, plant height, and mortality the year after pollination treatment. So at 30%, the next year plants had more flowers, bigger leaves, were taller, and died less frequently than any other pollination treatment. So that's what we said to the DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service, who are implementing this recovery program. Go ahead and hand pollinate, but just do 30% of the flowers, and all should be good. We also deal a lot with invasive species. Driving down here today, I saw an awful lot in the ditch along the sides of the roads. And I'm sure you know of some of your worst invaders around here. They're not only environmentally damaging, they're economically costly, costing the U.S. $138 billion a year. Of that, plants are responsible for about $35 billion. They've come in a variety of ways. Purple loosestrife came in the 1800s as a contaminant in ballast water. It's also been introduced horticulturally a number of times. Yellow star thistle came in as a contaminant of forage. It's now taken over large tracts of the western U.S. And water chestnut here, this is the ornamental water chestnut, not the kind you eat in Chinese food, came in to a botanical garden, came into the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and escaped from there. At Lake Champlain, pictured here, you can see what it's doing. They're spending about $4 million a year trying to control it there and are losing the battle. So we need to address the pathways that these plants come into the U.S., as well as determining ways to manage them. And horticulture is one of the most common pathways for these species to enter. And this is where a botanic garden has a kind of schizophrenic position, because we do bring in plants from other parts of the world. We grow them so you can see them. Maybe you want them in your yard. But we need to be really careful when we do that. We need to do some risk assessment and assure ourselves and the conservation community that we're not bringing in the next new invader. So what we do at Chicago is we have a list of about 150 species that we know are problematic in northern Illinois. We have removed those from our collections. We don't bring them in. We don't recommend them. We don't grow them. And you can find that list on our website if you're interested. Anything that we bring in new to Illinois from other parts of the country, we do a risk assessment on. And this is an exercise on paper where we ask, does the plant have this variety of characteristics like short reproduction time, both vegetative and seed production. I think I have a list of them here in a second, you'll see. And then for things that are new to the U.S., we do both this paper risk assessment and an in-ground evaluation looking at how do they behave in our region. Yeah, here are the risk assessment characteristics. One of these won't kick a plant out, but if they have more than one, and it's a kind of decision tree we work through, chances are it's something we won't grow. We're interested in climate change and the effects of climate change on plants as well. This is a exercise that was done a number of years ago, but I think is still a pretty good estimate of, as the temperature increases, and hopefully it won't be much more than this, but it will be somewhere in this range, how many species in the U.S. will be completely outside of their climate envelope, will find themselves in a climate where they have never grown before, and it's about 20% of the plants. And that's a pretty large number that could be driven to extinction if they can't move or if they can't adapt to this new climate. In the past, when we had climate changes, plants moved up and down, animals moved up and down in latitude pretty freely. There weren't a lot of barriers. But when you look at our landscape now, and I looked at a big chunk of it this morning on the drive down, there are very few places where those plants can move. Most of our landscape is converted to agriculture or suburbia or urban areas. And then when you add in barriers of rivers and mountains, okay, we don't have mountains here in the Midwest, but inhospitable habitat, the chances of plants being able to migrate appropriately looks pretty sad. So we have a number of programs looking at the effects of climate change or related to climate change. And I'll go through these pretty quickly. Project Budburst is a national citizen science campaign to collect data on flowering phenology. Phenology is the timing of natural events, like when does a plant leaf out, when does the first flower open, when do the leaves change color in the fall. And we have about 5,000 volunteers now across the country collecting this data and submitting it to our website, which is www.budburst.org. And then we're able to take that data and compare it to historical phenology data when that's available. We're lucky in the Chicago region that we have phenology data in our local flora. And so we did a comparison last year and looked at phenology recorded by Swink and Wilhelm, the authors of our Flora of the Chicago region. And they recorded in that book the date they saw each plant species flower, the range of flowering times that they saw from 1950 to 1994. And these two guys were avid botanists, and they were out in the field all the time, and they have amazing photographic memories. And so they had really good data. So we compared what we have from Budburst in the last 3 years to what Floyd and Jerry saw, and half the species have an earlier flowering date in the last 3 years than they have at all in from 1950 to 1994. And I talked to Jerry about this, and I said, are you seeing the same thing? Are you finding this? And he said, yeah, I am. At first I thought, it was an odd year, but I'm realizing every year's an odd year now, and that flowering times are changing. And he also mentioned that about half the species that were common when he wrote the first edition of the book have now disappeared from the Chicago region. And so not only are species changing the time they flower, many of them are either becoming extirpated from our area or, we hope, moving to cooler climates. We have another project that's just going in the ground. Some went in last spring, and some will go in next spring, but we're calling it the Floral Report Card, which is an experimental phenology garden where we've created identical gardens at now 10 locations, not 7, across the U.S. And we collected 7 native species from 4 different hardiness zones, so on a transect basically from Minnesota down to Arkansas, and cloned them, and now have them planted in these gardens from Seattle to North Carolina and a number of places in between. And so we'll be able to see over time as volunteers and staff at these gardens monitor phenology, how these plants are faring in different climates. Essentially, we're swapping space for time. We're allowing different climates to be experienced by these plants by moving them in space rather than in time. So this is what it looks like. Those are some of the species we're using. And we hope, in a few years we'll have some really interesting data to be able to share with you. We're also using climate envelope modeling to predict range shifts for some of our rarest species. This is work by Patty Vitt, my colleague at the garden. She looked at the 17 rarest species in our area and modeled where they occur currently and where they're predicted to occur under doubling of CO2 conditions. And this is just a list of the climate variables that she used. And she got results like this. This is pitcher's thistle, an endemic, threatened thistle that occurs around Lake Michigan and Huron here. The dots are its current distribution. The way you read these is the cooler colors are marginal climates for the plant. The warmer colors are the ideal climate for the plant. And here's the current conditions. So you can see already the lower end of the range is kind of in marginal climate. And if we double CO2, most of the populations are going to be outside any climate they've ever experienced in the past. And they may hang on up here, but then there's also this kind of intriguing ideal climate over there on Lake Ontario. And that begs the question, 1, is there habitat for the species there? And 2, if there is, should we consider moving it there? And that's a real controversial subject in conservation. Do you assist migration of rare plants and animals to new locations? And that's something we're battling with. In the meantime, we're using a volunteer program called Plants of Concern to ground truth some of these models. We have, the numbers are even larger. This is an old slide. I apologize. I thought I pulled the current one. It's now about 500 volunteers monitoring about 600 sites of 200 rare plant species. And so these volunteers go out. They assess is the population still there? How many plants are there? In many cases, they're doing demographic modeling of tagged plants, looking at how many new juveniles are there. This is a wealth of data that's available. We share this with the state, and we'll share it with researchers as well, now dating back to 2001. So we have about 10 years of data on all these species. What we're doing now in terms of climate change, and I think the most rational thing we can do now, is to bank seeds. And we've really stepped up our seed banking program at the garden. We have about 1,500 species in our seed bank. We're aiming for about 3,000, which is basically the entire upper Midwest flora, with the exception of those species that don't withstand storage. Some of the oaks, for example, won't last in storage. But most species will last when you dry and freeze their seeds. And on average, they last 200 years under those conditions. So it's a wonderful way to preserve plants long term. And we may not make the decision where those plants are restored in the future. That may be the next generation of biologists. But that resource is there for restoration, whether it's in historic sites or whether it's in new sites. Okay, I think I mentioned most of that. Our seed bank is available to restoration and research folks. We're happy to share germplasm. We're part of a national network doing this all over the country called Seeds of Success. Seeds of Success has the goal of banking the entire U.S. flora in the next 20 years. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us and a lot of money to raise. Another area of research is carbon sequestration. Are there things we can do to help mitigate climate change? And we're particularly interested in prairies, and we're asking the question, do prairie restorations sequester carbon as well as native remnant prairies? And we're interested in prairies because of this incredible amount of biomass underground that is a wonderful long-term sink for carbon. And this is some work by Jim Tang, who is a former postdoc at the garden, who's now at Woods Hole. And he looked at a chronosequence of restorations, so restorations of different ages, and the amount of carbon they were sequestering, and compared those to remnant prairies. And you can see that over time, after about 30 years, those restored prairies are sequestering almost as much carbon as our remnants. So he concluded that remnant prairies are best. We should do our best to preserve those. But over the longer term, these restorations are very valuable too. I want to move on to some of the training programs we do. We have something we call the Conservation and Land Management Intern Program, where we take recent graduates, and these are people both with bachelor's and master's degrees. So if you know recent graduates that might be interested, please send them our way. We recruit, we hire, and we do the training for this intern program. We place about 150 interns a year out on public lands. We partner primarily with Bureau of Land Management, but we also have interns in national parks and with the Forest Service, and hopefully next year with the refuge system as well. The training is done out at the Grand Canyon for a week, which is a wonderful place to go. And we kind of refresh them on things that they've probably learned along the way but may have forgotten. GIS, Endangered Species Act, field safety, map and compass skills, plant and animal ID, animal handling, and plant and animal monitoring techniques. And then these interns go on and they spend 5 or 10 months in a paid internship on public lands. And it's a wonderful way for them to get their foot in the door into a career in land management, if that's the direction they want to go. What we're hearing from the agencies, and remember way back at the beginning I said a botanist in a federal agency was responsible for 4 million acres of land. They need this help. They need it very badly. Because not only are the federal agencies not spending a lot of money, as I showed you, and don't have a lot of staff, the staff they have are old. 50% of the federal botanists are within 5 years of retirement. So this is also a way to get the next generation in, to do some mentoring of those new employees and get some of the stored knowledge that these older botanists have into new folks. All right, so last. We are a Botanic Garden doing conservation. We wanted to walk the talk. We wanted to have a green building for our new science center. And we started this about 4 years ago, where we had a sustainability review of our campus that looked at everything from water conservation to waste disposal to air pollution, green buildings, green fleet, all these issues. And we have improved greatly our operations based on that report that was done by Shaw Environmental. the most obvious of those improvements was our new science center that was in the design phase at that point, but this report really pushed us to make it as green and as sustainable as we could. So I mentioned we got LEED Gold status for it. We have sustainable design elements in clean air, alternative transportation, energy efficiency. We have a roof garden, limiting the impact on the land, pollution, waste prevention, recycled regional and eco materials, and water efficiencies. So I just have a series now of photos that I'll show you. So this is the front of the building, and some of the green features that you'll see right off are a lot of daylight comes into the building, so we have hardly any need for lights during the day. This is a bridge that goes over, and you'll see it in another shot a little better, a bioswale, or rain garden that goes around the building. The site itself was wetlands, a very degraded wetland, but it was a site for water storage on our property. And had we filled in order to put this building in, we would have had to do compensatory rainwater storage somewhere else on our site. We decided instead to put the building on piers and build a bioswale and rain garden around it and address the issue that way. We used a lot of the materials from the site on the site. So these planter boxes are made from the cottonwood trees that came down in order for the building to go in. We have a green roof on both sides here. And it's not your typical sedum. There is some sedum. That strip right there is sedum. But we're using this as an evaluation garden to test what other plants will do well on green roofs. So we have different depths of medium from 4 to 8 inches. And we have plants on one side of the roof from all over the world, and on the other side, just native to North America. And we're testing them to see how they perform. And they're doing surprisingly well. We have photovoltaics around the whole kind of perimeter of the roof that provide about 10% of our electricity, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this is a lab building, and the amount of air turnover we have to do for OSHA standards takes a lot of energy. We have radiant heating and cooling in the floors. This is before the floor was poured. You can see the pipes that carry the warm or cool water. The rest of the flooring in the office areas is from recycled tires there. This is another use of wood that came down on the site. This is our little library in the building, and that's a black walnut wall. And this is some of the office space, and again you can see there's a lot of light coming in through these clerestory windows. There are offices there, and then big windows on the outside. That's a better shot of the rain garden going around, and you can see the building up on piers there. The other real unique aspect of this building is it's open to the public, and we wanted to demonstrate science to the public. And so this gallery down the middle of the building is open every time the garden is, 9 to 5, 364 days a year. And there's interpretive benches in front of every lab. There are these touch screen things that have games on them, that have videos about the scientists. So you can come in, you can learn about what we're doing, and you can see in to the labs. And the scientists at first were a little reluctant about that, but we've gotten used to it. And it's really not too obtrusive. So you can see here's from inside the lab looking out. You really don't notice the people out there. And there is no sound, so they can't knock and ask you questions. We have 9 new labs in this building. The reproductive biology lab shown there, a seed bank, a GIS lab, a molecular lab, a herbarium, ecology and plant biology, or ecology and population biology lab, and a soils lab. So it's a wonderful facility. We're thrilled to be in it after 10 years in trailers. It was time. And if If you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to answer your questions about the building or the work we do, or I'd encourage you to come up and visit us. And I just want to thank some of the colleagues that shared their data with me, and be happy to answer your questions. Yes?
I have a question from an urban planning perspective. I'm interested in the slide you showed where barriers are becoming more and more in existence because of buildings or whatever's happening on the land. And if there are suggestions that you all have come up with to share with county and city decision-making bodies that would help minimize some of those barriers.
The suggestion, and it's not a new one, is really building or saving corridors between large tracts of natural land. These corridors will allow plant and animal species to migrate through them. The downside of corridors is there are also corridors for invasive species, and so you really need to manage them well and balance that with the ability for having a corridor for movement. But when you think about plants, most of them don't have the ability to disperse over large landscape discontinuities. Most of them drop their seeds by gravity or by wind, and they're just going a little ways. There's some that are carried by birds and other animals that can go further. But the majority of plants don't move very far. And if there's anything in the way, it makes it very difficult for it to get across that. Yeah.
How interested is the U.S. and Illinois highway departments in dealing with issues like invasive species and getting natural plantings along the highways? I know there have been, my way of thinking, sporadic attempts.
There have been.
But the control, for example, seems to be being moved by the highway department.
Yeah, there's certainly a number of invasives, teasel, phragmites, phalaris, that purple loosestrife that you see in every ditch along every highway, and part of them are being moved by mowing and other activities. That said, I think departments of transportation understand this issue and would like to address it, and many have planted native species. In fact, along I-55 between Chicago and St. Louis, there's a lot of prairie plantings on the sides of the road. Some states are better than others at that. But yeah, I don't know that we have the financial wherewithal to deal with it in the way we need to get rid of those invasives. Brenda?
When it comes to the subject of assisted migration, I'm curious to know what is the position of the Chicago Botanic Garden regarding that, and botanical gardens in general.
I think we're still on the fence. I think for many species, we recognize they may likely go extinct without some assisted migration. And by banking the seeds, we have that option for the future. So we're going that far. We're saying we're going to keep this option open. We're also starting to do some of the research to address, if we have a common garden for Circean pitcheri that we're going to do up in Upper Michigan next year, and see, if we were to move it that far north, would it survive? Similarly, the floral report card garden addresses some of those issues. And I think we need to do a lot of these kind of reciprocal transplant common garden experiments to answer the questions of, is it feasible? Are there going to be negative consequences of outbreeding depression if we do this? And there's also been a lot of work, not at our garden, but by Sarah Reichard out at University of Washington and by Fairchild Garden, looking at the invasive issue related to assisted migration. There's a worry that if you move a plant outside its historic range, it could become invasive. And what's coming down from those studies is if the movement is a relatively short distance within a continent and focusing on plants that are fairly conservative already, it's probably not going to be a big problem.
For the typical homeowner, is there a list of plants that you would particularly like homeowners to have in their yard?
We have a list on our website called Illinois Best Plants, and this was done by our collections department, so I'll give it that caveat. These aren't best plants just for conservation. These are plants that do well in Illinois. Some of them may be exotic, but we did go through and cull anything that might be invasive off that list. So these are things that are well behaved, they will do well in your garden, and many of them are natives, and as a native provide habitat or resources for pollinators and other species.
Could I just add to that? I volunteer for a local conservation group called Granbury Friends, and we're in the process. We're going to, on our website, put up a section about using native plants in your home and landscape. So look for that.
I think Illinois Native Plant Society may have some recommended plants on their website as well.
Wild ones.
Wild ones, yeah. Another good native landscaping source. Yes, in the back.
You had, earlier in your presentation, you raised the question of hybridization between a rare species and a native species, and that you were struggling whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just curious, in a more general question, is there a framework in your area of research to evaluate questions like that? And forget the answer,
Yeah.
is there even a framework for doing that kind of analysis?
There is a framework to look at the hybridization issue. And where it gets very fuzzy is the one I showed you, where it's a native species and they're still within their historic range, and the hybridization is occurring at the same rate or maybe a little higher rate than it did in the past. It's really difficult to know what to do in that case, but there is this decision tree for hybridization, and if it's an exotic plant hybridizing with a native, then you should be worried and remove the exotic, and there are a number of decisions along the tree like that. But this one is still a question of debate. Yes?
I think a new building's been open about a year.
Yes.
Have you done any monitoring to see how it's performing energy-wise?
We are, and I have to confess that's outside my area, so I don't know exactly the answer, but we had to do a lot of monitoring in order to report to LEED what the building was doing. There's also temperature sensors on the roof at the level of the membrane, at the level of the soil, and 3 feet above the soil to look at how much is the green roof retaining heat as well as cooling the air around it.
And the cool slab, is there condensation problems with that?
No, none.
As far as the green roofs, do you have that data in any report yet about the different plants that you're trying, or is there?
No. For all our plant evaluations, we go 4 years before we do a report, just to capture the variation and make sure they're going to last that long. That data will be coming out in our plant evaluation reports from our plant evaluation program starting 3 years from now. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, this one, any questions? Do you water plants on your roofs? Are you?
No, we watered them only when we planted them to get them established. So we planted last August. We watered through to October, the frost. Didn't water this year. And we don't plan to water other than when we put something new in to get it established.
So your results will be specific to the climate?
Yes, yes. Which is rather harsh. Yes.
Just curious, I've seen some of the rooftop stuff in like Chicago, like the mayor's building or whatever. Are you all involved with those projects, or are they feeding off of what you guys are trying? Or
We are not involved we weren't involved in planning the City Hall roof, but they do receive or will receive our plant evaluation reports so they can choose to add plants that we recommend in the future. We do have a grad student who is studying City Hall roof and a number of other green roofs, including ours, as urban refugia for pollinators, particularly bees. And so she's catching bees on all these different roofs and comparing it to the bees she catches out in native prairies.
Who are they working with? I'm just curious.
City Hall?
Yeah.
It's probably the Chicago Parks Department is my guess.